Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Donald Trump has named Thomas Rose, a journalist and entrepreneur, as the new U.S. ambassador to Poland. Rose, a former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and political commentator, has voiced strong support for a robust Polish-American alliance. Meanwhile, in a turn of events, U.S. aid to Georgia has been halted, raising concerns about regional stability and American commitments in Eastern Europe. What do these developments signal for U.S. foreign policy? Well, joining us today on TVP World to discuss is Scott Lucas, professor of international politics at University College Dublin. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me here.
So first, let's go through the appointment of Thomas Rose, and what does that signal for the future of U.S.-Poland relations? What's your read on it?
Well, I think my read on it is we're going to possibly enter a very tense time, not just because of what it does with U.S. and Poland, but what it does with U.S. relations with other countries. Why do I say that? Thomas Rose, on the surface, is the former editor of the Jerusalem Post. He was an advisor to the vice president in Trump's first term, Mike Pence, but he's probably best known now for being a very right-wing commentator on U.S. radio. Okay, that's fair enough. There are a lot of right-wing commentators out there, but he has a certain set of very loud opinions that might have implications in terms of how he does his job. Specifically regarding Poland, he's very much a supporter, or has been a supporter, of the Law and Justice Party. Now, the Law and Justice Party was, of course, the Polish government until fairly recently. Nothing wrong with that in terms of supporting a party. Nothing wrong with being a very big supporter of President Duda. That's fine. But the question is, of course, is as an ambassador, how will Rose negotiate relations with the current government, the centrist coalition? Now, the centrist coalition is saying very clearly today, look, we welcome Ambassador Rose coming in. We will work with him. We don't want him to look just at the right-wing media in terms of what Poland is. But it's the wider context I think is interesting. In the last 24 hours alone, Thomas Rose has attacked, and by attack I meant spread disinformation about the U.S. Agency for International Development. He has spread disinformation that the Agency for International Development has supported terrorism in Palestine, specifically Gaza. He has spread disinformation that USAID is giving money to U.S. media outlets. He has spread disinformation that USAID is giving money to the BBC. Now, why is that important? Because, of course, the Trump administration is attacking the U.S. Agency for International Development and has effectively closed it, suspended all of its staff, closed down almost all of its programs, including the programs in Georgia that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But, and I know we need to discuss other matters, let me just also add this. Thomas Rose has not only attacked the U.S. Agency for International Development in the last 24 hours, he has attacked other U.S. agencies as being part of the deep state. In other words, part of an attack that has been carried out by Donald Trump and Elon Musk across the whole range of U.S. government. What will that say for stability in terms of U.S. diplomacy, including with Poland?
Sorry, can you help me clarify what you meant by the disinformation when it comes to USAID being used to fund media? Because we do have a statement coming from the White House press secretary listing out the money that have went to these media publications from the USAID funds.
Well, first of all, some of the projects that were listed by the White House spokesman were not USAID projects. For what it's worth, they were State Department projects. For what it's worth, the White House was listing misrepresenting projects that USAID supported. So, for example, it talked about the USAID supporting a transgender opera in Colombia. No, it was not a transgender opera. It was a play, a musical, in which one of the characters was transgender, very differently. The White House falsely said that USAID had given $50 million for condoms in Gaza. That's absolutely untrue. USAID gave no money for condoms in Gaza. But then what it's gone further to do is to say that the USAID gave $8.5 million to Politico, an international media publication. That is absolutely false. What USAID did was they purchased a subscription to Politico Pro. Now that's a pay, media service, one that you have to subscribe to, and they do that because they want the information from Politico Pro. But that's not funding this organization for manipulation. It's simply basically part of your subscriptions to newspapers, magazines, etc. Now Rose is out there spreading all of this with absolutely no context, no attempt to refute it. As an ambassador, one would hope he'd be much more responsible, especially when effectively he's representing a government, a U.S. government, which is supposed to be stable with strong agencies, not agencies that are being torn down.
Right. In our discussion with Mr. Rose, he actually mentioned that, well, post-election, many countries should be concerned with Donald Trump coming into office, but he actually listed Poland as one of the countries that could really benefit from a bilateral relationship once Mr. Trump gets into office. So what's your read on his take on this bilateral relationship that he's mentioning? Especially, he seems to be very optimistic with the cooperation on the security front of things.
Well, I mean, it's certainly during the Trump first term, you will recall that Poland very much tried to appeal to Trump by talking about how it really wanted to work with the Americans on security. It even talked about having a U.S. military base called Fort Trump. And that's the way you kind of work with Trump and you flatter him. And in addition, Tom Rose is very close to specific groups in Poland. As I mentioned, the Law and Justice Party and specific politicians. Now, those are relationships that could be cultivated. But there's two issues here. One is, do you cultivate those relationships impartially? You shouldn't just simply be working with only one political party in Poland, for example. And you certainly shouldn't be working with only right-wing groups in Poland, because those are the views you tend to have. And secondly, and I think this is probably more troubling, Tom Rose is out there saying, well, Poland can choose to be a member of the EU, or it can choose its friends. In other words, there is an implication here that the U.S. approach, or at least the Trump approach to Poland, will be a divide and rule approach, which is we want to work with Poland, but we want to separate it from the European Union at the same time. And I think that would cause obvious difficulties, let's say, for Polish government and for Polish business.
Right, and Ms. Rose is also a pretty strong critique of the Polish prime minister. Do you think that establishing him as an ambassador will create some conflicts between the two countries?
That's going to be up to Thomas Rose. I mean, that the question, already it is significant that the centrist coalition has put out the statements, which is, look, we want this to be a cooperative relationship. It has also said, and I did mention this, but we don't want Thomas Rose just relying on the right wing in Poland for his information. In other words, we want him to develop relationships with everyone, which is what a good ambassador should do. My concerns here that I'm expressing to you, and I've got to be honest, as a friend of Poland, as a friend of good relations with Poland, is Thomas Rose going to be that person that's going to be politically neutral? He's going to check his ideology at the door. He's going to check his opinions at the door to work with all groups in Poland, or is he going to bring in that very, very right-wing ideology and try to impose it in the way that he talks to Poles? Trump first term, we had different ambassadors. We had some ambassadors that very much acted as diplomats. We have some, and I'll go ahead and mention Richard Grenell, who was the ambassador to Germany, who went in effectively saying, you follow Trump's way or you go on the highway. And my fear is that Tom Rose could be the latter rather than the former.
Right, and we still have a little bit of time that I want to touch on the U.S. aid, like you mentioned, that's been cut right now. Before we go to the Georgia situation, because this is being decided today, can you tell us whether or not the U.S. aid is going to be back sooner rather than later, or is it just gone?
If Donald Trump, Elon Musk have their way, the best, and I mean the best out of very bad options, is that USAID will be folded into the State Department with a much reduced budget and a much reduced staff. The worst option, of course, is that it disappears entirely. And let us be clear about what the significance of that is. USAID has about $43 billion in funding. Far from this being funding which is just simply corrupt, which is the smear I've heard from Trumpists for the last 48 hours. Far from it being aid which is given to terrorists, we're talking about aid, for example, to healthcare programs. Programs, for example, such as in Africa, that try to deal with HIV and AIDS. This is programs that support independent journalists. not a particular journalist, independent journalist, especially in countries that are trying to have a free media. This is programs to support democracy promotion and to support civic society. It is programs to support clean energy, which we need. In other words, USAID is providing vital work, not to be left or right, Democrat or Republican, but to try to deal with the critical issues that affect each of our communities right now, and to simply try to attack it as part of a political project that started with Project 2025, the Trumpist blueprint, and that continues with Mr. Musk. It is dangerous, it is irresponsible, and it will do lasting disservice to the image of America around the world.
When we talk about Trump's intervention when it comes to kind of international relations, we do know that his strong rhetoric against NATO eventually actually urged NATO to put more spending into defense and grow stronger and more self-reliant. Do you think that the lack of U.S. aid could actually push Georgia closer to the EU, or do you think it actually risks weakening the Western orientation?
I mean, I think the first thing that's going to happen with USAID going is you're going to see Russia go into Georgia, and it's going to say to Georgians, look, some of you were talking about closer relations with the West, including the U.S. Look at where that's got you. Has that worked out for you? Don't go to the U.S., come to us. And this is a very critical time in Georgia. Your audience knows that, right? That USAID, not to impose the U.S. government on Georgia, but the USAID was supporting democracy and the call for rights in Georgia. Now, Russia's going to be able to have a vacuum to move into because the USAID programs are gone. I think it's going to be very important for Poland and other countries to rally together, not because of Donald Trump, but despite Donald Trump. It's going to be very important because of the damage that Trump is causing, that Europe shows, look, we are not here to be pro or anti-Trump. We are here to support Georgia. And we hope that Washington will come to its senses on this. My fear is it won't, because let me give you one story that tells you the problem we have. When Donald Trump had a briefing on Georgia in his first term, and this comes from Fiona Hill, who was one of his close advisors, Donald Trump spent the entire session asking about the U.S. state of Georgia.
Well, I was just having a conversation.
He didn't realize there was a country called Georgia. That's the level that we have to start from when we deal with this current administration.
Do you believe that perhaps this is strong enough an argument to actually convince those in Washington that these aid are not just charity, but like you mentioned, is actually a very strong form of soft power and remaining a grip on some of these countries to not create a power vacuum which would let countries like Russia and China step in?
It should be a strong enough argument, but we have a problem in that the U.S. system is being decimated. What Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Project 2025 are doing is they're going around the backs of Congress to do this. They're not seeking congressional approval. But even if they were, the Republicans in Congress have effectively just laid down before Trump. They're offering absolutely no resistance to this. Witness the fact that they approved all his cabinet nominees, even though many were unqualified. The problem here is that Trump and Musk are not paying any attention to the courts. And of course, they're not paying any attention to the agencies because they're trying to decimate them. So who do you work with in Washington to push back on this at this point? I think at this point, the best thing that can be done is to get that message out, just like you're talking about, which is that U.S. soft power relies on effective U.S. agencies. And you hope that you make your networks, your channels with Washington, where if there's pushback against the Trump-Musk project in a few weeks, then we've got some type of leverage to try to repair the damage.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Thanks for being with us on TVP World. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.